Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 3rd, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And this is the last of 3 episode intros that I am pre-recording before I leave for a trip to Australia and New Zealand with the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. I should be getting back today. Time travel is weird like that, isn't it? So next week, I will make sure to thank any patrons that I missed in the meantime. And now I say we just dive into it. This is a fascinating episode. I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Roopika Risam. She is a professor of digital humanities and social engagement at Dartmouth, where her research explores how histories of race, empire, and technology shape the modern world. She's written several books, including New Digital Worlds, and was a co-editor of Anti-Racist Community Engagement and the Digital Black Atlantic. She's also the past president of the Association for Computers and the Humanities. But today we're going to be talking about her newest book. It's called Data Empire: The Power of Information to Organize, Control, and Dominate. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Roopika Risam. Well, Roopika, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Cara. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so pumped to talk about not just your new book, but also all of the work that you do and how it feeds into this story that you have to tell, which I think is, it's one of those interesting ideas that is unique in that we don't often, I guess, think about history and power structures having to do with data, especially historically. I think more and more people are being attuned to that now. But so it's like a unique way of telling this important insight, but also incredibly ubiquitous, and probably everybody goes, duh, once you start to talk about it, right?
Absolutely. I feel like that's sort of the story of my life, which is I'm saying things that I feel like are very, very obvious. And yet in conversation, they're not. But once we
Mm.
start talking about it, all of a sudden those dots get connected.
Absolutely. So before we even get into the book, let's dig into sort of your academic positioning, because it's a very interesting, multidisciplinary position, I guess. Wow, that wasn't redundant at all. So you are an associate professor of digital humanities and social engagement at Dartmouth. What department, or are you like matrixed between departments?
I'm actually a full professor now as of
Oh!
10 days ago.
Stop it. I love it. Okay, I'm going to update that for the intro. And I'm so, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very excited. It's been a long time. And yes, I am this professor of this thing called digital humanities and social engagement, but I'm situated in 2 departments, the film and media studies department and the comparative literature department.
Ah, interesting. Okay,
But I can make this way more complicated by explaining that I have a PhD in English.
Okay.
And I started out my career at Salem State University, a public university in Massachusetts, where I was in an English and a higher education department. And so I go where they'll take me, really. Anywhere that wants to let me do my work.
I love it. You know, where I did my PhD, media studies, was in the psychology department.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so it's I think a lot of these kind of boundaries are quite wiggly, right? This is definitely I don't know, I've had whole episodes that we dedicated to the problem, non-problem of human beings really needing to categorize things and put labels on things.
Yeah, very fitting considering the topic of my book.
So this is so interesting. So you studied English. You're working in these 2 different departments that really have a lot of kind of culture and societal influence. You know, we're talking about historical, but also contemporary ways that individuals, I guess, not even just individuals, but whole systems exist within culture, and how that shifts and changes. So that has everything to do with race and gender and class and kind of country of origin, and also capitalism and socialism and different kind of financial structures and different governmental structures. Like, how do you even know where to focus your attention?
My interests have always been on the impact of colonialism on culture and on
Mm,
history. And it started with literature because when I was in college and read post colonial literature, so literature from countries like India or Jamaica for the first time, I felt like the writers put language to experiences that I had had that
mm,
I didn't know how to talk about, being an immigrant to the US myself as a young child and coming from a family who's originally from Kashmir. And so I was really interested because I thought, okay, there's a language for talking about why it feels like some countries have more power over each other and how did I even get here? And so the point of entry for me was literature, but very, very quickly, I started becoming interested in history. I started becoming interested in digital culture and how we have these incredible tools for content creation available to us, whether it's to do it as individuals who want to tell our own stories or as academics who want to tell stories that haven't been told that come out of their research. And yet I always felt like, why aren't people actually using these tools to do that important thing? And that's why I got interested in the field of digital humanities. And it was at a moment in time in the late 2010s where rather it was in the early 2010s where the field was sort of starting to be a thing. And I thought, okay, here's actually my moment to say, we have these powerful tools. Let's actually use them to not just tell everybody who Shakespeare is.
right. Such an such an interesting origin story. Do you have family still in Kashmir?
Oh, yeah, of course. Of
So
course.
when you do you consider, I've had a lot of folks on the show when we talk about, intersectionality and identity and I guess the struggles and the difficulties, but also the beauty in, being bicultural or multicultural. Do you consider yourself like a firmly bicultural individual?
At the very least.
Mm, mhm.
S So I was born in Wales,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
and because my parents left Kashmir in the early '70s and they went to the UK and they lived in London, outside of London, and eventually in Wales, where I was born, and then they decided after about 4 or 5 years there that they wanted something different from their lives, and we had some family in the US, and so we came here, and so I very much feel Kashmiri. I very much feel British, and I
Mhm.
also feel
Mhm.
American. And so it's very strange, but, you can take the best parts of of all of it and try to ignore the rest.
Yeah, yeah, better advice I have not heard. It's something we often talk about so I work as a psychologist in a cancer center, and very often when we're talking about, I don't know, mortality and religion and politics and all of these deeply existential things that people are grappling with today, that seems to be the consensus amongst, the professionals and the patients alike, is sort of take what serves you, take what you find joy in, and just leave the rest behind.
It's it's really all we can do, especially when we consider so many of the pressures that we're dealing with right now from particularly in the US, from a political system that feels very much in turmoil.
To put it lightly. Yeah. Agree wholeheartedly. So it's so interesting, this kind of very intersectional approach that you take to understanding, our contemporary, I guess, placement or situation, context, milieu, against the historical background, especially with an eye towards colonialism, which of course encompasses all of those different features of misogyny and supremacy and racism and just power and othering. And 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 yet this story, not and yet, but and also this story specifically is about like information. It's about data. So when we think about data, I think we often think about the internet or computers or modern tools that are used to store data or even like DNA. But I think a lot of us forget that data really is just what recorded information. It's a meta concept of seeing or organizing information and figuring out a way to transmit it. It could have been quite crude in the past, right?
Absolutely, and the way I think of it is that most things really just aren't that new,
Mhm.
and even if they are, we got them somehow, and my interest has always been how far back can we trace an idea, a concept that is being positioned as being new or disruptive or unprecedented, which is my least favorite word. Um,
Disruptive, yeah, unprecedented. Oh god.
So, if we look as far back as we can, based on what archaeologists have found so far, we get back 43,000 years ago to the mountains at the border of Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa, the La Mambo Mountains, where archaeologists have found a baboon femur with these notches on it. And they've determined that they're not decorative and they're not accidental. And so someone was intentionally carving these little markers and they were tracking something. And
Mhm.
it's so powerful just to think 43,000 years ago, someone thought, I need to remember something I'm seeing or a phenomenon I'm observing. And therefore, I'm going to carve these little notches into this bone to do that. And what else are we doing now, really, other than carving notches in bones? Only now we have computers.
Absolutely. Even this concept of counting before we may have even developed a system for I've always been fascinated by the idea that mathematics is, not really a language. We can talk about it like it's a language of organization, but very, very simple mathematics is in some ways baked into the fabric of reality, and I think about that a lot when I think about our relationship to science, our relationship to the humanities, that a lot of what we do is just to try to use language or use tools to conceptualize things that we're just observing anyway.
Absolutely, and that's where I start the story of data, which is that it's simply about creating a physical representation or a material representation of something that we think is important, and that for me is actually why I get very frustrated when people try to claim that data is neutral and objective because even from that moment 43,000 years ago, there was an intention there. There was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
decision to count and to track. And that's still happening.
I just don't I've never understood the argument. I see it all the time working in the sciences and kind of working within this subculture of scientific skepticism where I notice a lot of, like you said, claims that either scientific approaches or data can somehow be neutral or unbiased or kind of like perfectly representative of uh existence that is out there. And it's like I feel like just saying it's done by people should be enough, right? Like people have minds and they make decisions about what they want to count and what they don't want to count. And they make decisions about why things are important and other things are less important. And you can't tease any bias. I mean, you can't not see bias inside of that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or wrong or there has to be a value judgment on it, although oftentimes there is one. But you can't be quote pure in your approach if you're a person because by definition of being a person, you have a perspective.
It's true. And I blame the late 17th century scientists for this. And then
Mm.
and the 18th century scientists as well, because that's when we first see the word data showing up in the English language, and it starts in math, and it's used synonymously with the givens of a proof. Like we're doing geometrical proofs and we're saying given, here's the fact. And that word eventually becomes used by people in royal societies for natural science as a way of talking about observed phenomena like a barometric measuring or where a star is in the sky that they
Hmm.
can write down, and it's been plucked out of its natural context and put down on a piece of paper, and then it can be compared with other measurements, or it could be analyzed or calculated and then generalized. Now, with the natural world, assuming that everyone has this shared vocabulary of how you are analyzing it, which isn't necessarily the case depending on one's culture and the cultural context in which one's doing science. Other than that case, the idea that you can just take something, write it down, compare it with something else, and then make a generalized theory based on it is hiding a whole lot of human hands
Yeah,
playing a role in it.
absolutely. And who are those human hands? And I think that's one of those. I mean, it's such a it's such a fascinating thing to start to try to really tease apart when you try to empathize with the oppressor, for example. You try to empathize with the colonist, or even just with the individuals who were in power due to all of the different factors and features, the cultural, historical milieu. There is a privilege, I don't use that word lightly, but there is a privilege that comes along with experiencing the world that you experience, and being told from the time you're born that your view is somehow more important, more dominant, more clean, more reflective of reality, that you probably just never questioned it. That there were probably a lot of these, 17th and 18th century thinkers that you were talking about, especially scientists, maybe less so the earlier philosophers, but also, no, I shouldn't say that, definitely the philosophers as well, but that just kind of were like, well, I was endowed with this smarty smart brain. Therefore, what I'm saying is probably the most real.
I wouldn't know. Never had that problem.
Me neither. But it's interesting to try to I think when we talk about colonialism from the perspective of hindsight and knowledge, what we know today, there's always conflict between the individuals who kind of see the havoc that has been wreaked, and the individuals, it's a very like right wing perspective that we see often in the United States of like, well, I wasn't there, it's not my fault, and we're past that, and it's all level playing field now, and you're like, okay, that is definitely not true. But I think when you get beyond that conflict and you try to see the world as it was through the eyes of those who were in power and architects, I'm always curious how much they knew, how much insight they had, I guess is a good way to put it, into what they were actually doing, and how much they thought that this was just the natural way of things existing.
I think they absolutely did. And when we think about the context of the 18th century, for example, in Europe, where a lot of this theorization of data is happening, these are the people who are in cultures that have gone out around the world and conquered other people and have felt that they absolutely had the right to it. So I'm not
Mhm.
sure why I would also simultaneously be expecting them to have a critical eye on the production of science.
Right. Such a good point. And it's fascinating to think that, and that's why I'm always like very eked out. I don't know if you have the same experience, but among my peers and colleagues in circles that I respect and run in, because I am very very pro science, I always get incredibly eked out and kind of feel a defensiveness rise when I hear rhetoric about, let's say, space exploration, or about mineral rights or mining, that feels so deeply colonial, with just this unapologetic, well, science for science sake, exploring is our sort of natural proclivity, and it's a good thing that we should make sure that we're always promoting. Not that I think it's wrong to ask open-ended questions, but I'm so worried about that reckless perspective, as if there is no potential downside to going places we've never been and just like fucking stuff up.
One of the things we always talk about in my house is it morally okay to colonize Mars?
Yes, exactly. It's a huge argument on my other podcast.
Yeah, because the thing is, one could argue there are no people there, but then, well, I
Hmm.
mean, what about the bacteria?
Yep. And that's what, yeah, that's always they're like, it's not the same as colonialism because there's no people there. And I'm like, yeah, but the colonists, at least the early ones who were like going west because they thought they might fall off the world if they didn't expect there to be people there.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's
And
absolutely true, right? They thought it was just the empty land.
yeah, and then when people were in the way, that's how they saw them. They're like, "Ooh, gotta get rid of this complication that we've run into." And I'm not saying if we go to Mars, we're gonna find people. We've been to Mars plenty of times with robots. We know there's no people. But it's that perspective that's that kind of very Western person. And I'm always just like, can we just listen to indigenous wisdom sometimes?
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know? Maybe once in a while.
I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is that when we talk about the most cutting edge large language models, we call them frontier models,
Ugh. Wow.
right? And it's just the
Wow.
language is so baked in right there.
Mhm, mhm. Gosh, I remember early on in my sort of identity development and then later in my career development in journalism and psychology, there's that inflection point where you realize like, ooh, patriarchy is everywhere, right? Or like white supremacy is everywhere. And I had a professor who would always say, yeah, it's the water we swim in. It's
Mhm.
why you don't even see it because it's all around us all the time. I can't imagine that for you, colonialism is the water you swim. I mean, you must see it kind of manifesting everywhere in language, in even in math.
Yeah, it ruins everything. I really wanted to enjoy Project Hail Mary.
Oh no.
I really did. No, actually, I thought it was great, but I definitely had that moment of, "Oh, no, here we go again."
Yeah, a friend just told me I need to see it because I loved The Martian, right? And I loved Andy Weir and I loved The Approach. But yeah, I was like, "Ugh, I have a feeling I'm gonna have the same experience.
It's wonderful, though. Don't please go see it. Please go see
Well,
it.
and I think that's the thing too. We still have to live in the world we live in, right? And I think a lot of times there's a black and white way of thinking. And I can't imagine, and tell me if this has been your experience, as an academic who raises a lot of these uncomfortable conversations and truths, I can imagine that you get trolls and haters and pushback from people who are very black and white in their thinking, who are kind of like, don't rain on our parade. Don't tell me all this bad stuff because I still want to be able to engage in the world that I engage in. And I still want, you know, progress and capitalism and all the things that make my life easier. But like, it's complicated. It's ambivalent. Both these things can be true at the same time, right?
Absolutely, I am the ruiner of fun in many cases, but at the same time, I mean, th this is the world that we live in, and the world that we live in is complicated, and I think one of my frustrations, whether it's coming from people who want to say racism doesn't exist,
Mm,
or people who want to say, "I have developed this leftist ideological purity test that you must adhere to if you want to be respected." Neither of those are really able to address the complexity of lived reality. And I don't say
mhm.
this to say I am all here to be a relativist about it. I mean, I think absolutely if you think that racism is not a problem, then we don't actually have very much to talk about,
Right, right,
because that is going to then influence this entire conversation, and I cannot take you very seriously unless you want to have a conversation about why you might be wrong, in which case,
right. But yeah, it's
fine.
almost an a priori assumption that if that is the, sacred cow you hold on to, every conversation beyond that is in some ways moot. Or
It's
at
true.
least it's deeply biased and you're probably not gonna get anywhere. It's like talking to a flat earther about physics or geometry. Like, there's just a certain point where it's like, there's no point in having this conversation.
It's absolutely true. I just worry so much though when I look at So what's happening right now in the US? I think about what's happening with NIH
Mhm.
or, what's happened with they're going after the Smithsonian now and just thinking about how on the one hand, sometimes I want to really dig in and I want to say, we absolutely cannot have this conversation. And
Mhm.
then on the other hand, how do we otherwise try and convince people that they're about to make really, really big mistakes that are going to have material harm on people and their lives?
Yeah. It's such a difficult place to be when individual reality is as polarized as it is. And yet, I have to always stop and say to myself, like, this isn't new, is it? It feels new to us in America, but this concept globally is not new. People have been way more polarized and yeah, I shouldn't say they got out without any suffering. There's been mass and horrific suffering because of it, but individuals have always persisted. And even 45,000 years ago with the baboon bone, there was probably a lot of polarization amongst small, hunter-gatherer tribes.
I'm sure there was. And I think back to really going to the moment where we start seeing humans settling down into more permanent living situations
Mhm.
instead of nomadic life. And particularly in ancient Mesopotamia, as more and more people came to settle down because it's a pretty good place to live. They had to start figuring out how do you actually deal with people who you're not related to and they're here and you all have to live together. And so one of the innovations in data is actually the development of tokens, which are simply just little counters made out of clay that people used to mark an obligation or a debt and to navigate that challenge of what happens when suddenly you can't inherently trust the people that you are living with because you are so different.
Mm. So it's almost like it's funny because everything we talk about with a hindsight bias, as if everything was leading up to this point intentionally, but it wasn't, right? It's just this we just happened to be at a point in history where we can not see the future, but we can see all the past, or at least as best as we can. And so, I say this with that caveat, but it's almost like an early tool for maybe money, barter, description, an early tool to allow for the structures that eventually will come into place to talk about property rights, to talk about individuation, me and my stuff versus you and your stuff.
Absolutely. And I think I always come back to trying to figure out to what extent is this a human thing, right? A
Mhm.
desire to say, this is mine and my family's, and this is yours and your family's, and I want that. How do I
Mhm.
get that? At the most basic level, though, it starts with being about survival. And then what I think happens over time is that what it means to survive changes. Because I always think about one of the distinctions between what it means to be, say, a Republican or a Democrat or conservative or a liberal is between, I'm looking out for my people.
Mhm.
For the Republican, that's my blood family. And for the Democrat, in some cases, in many cases, it's I'm looking out for people. That people
Mhm.
are my people. And this mentality between a really expansive notion of who counts as the people that you're going to make a political decision about representation to support. Um, is it all people or is it your perception of your blood family?
Mhm.
And I think one makes very different kinds of decisions if you're looking at those 2 different scales. And then I think, for example, too, I mean, I vote for Democrats. And not always a huge fan, but I mean, it's better than the alternative.
Mhm.
And, I make decisions that either either going to have very little impact on my life individually, or in some cases are probably gonna mean I'm gonna pay more taxes, but actually do not care
Right.
because, like, I'm good, and I know that the alternative is potentially going to be so much worse for people who are more vulnerable.
Right. Kind of an understanding or at least a hope, because I don't know if we've ever been able to engage in this experiment fully, but a hope that if the most vulnerable among us at least have a basic level of safety and comfort, all of us will benefit from that versus let's see how much me and mine can ensure my own safety and, everybody else, you do you.
Yeah. It is, and then the conversely, on, say, the right-wing side of the political spectrum, the most vulnerable person having rights becomes the threat to them and their family,
Right,
right?
exactly, because it means, because it's a zero-sum game,
Mhm.
and that means I have to take from what I worked so hard for and give to you, even though I look at you and I don't see you as working as hard as I am.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is a very common perspective, and, while I don't think it is reflective of reality or, I don't see validity in it, I do always strive from a kind of, um I don't know, from I always strive to at least try to understand it from that perspective, instead of just discounting it whole cloth. I always wanna understand why people think the way they think.
I agree, and I think part of it is also education
Mhm.
and really understanding what the perspective you're opposed to is, or what the person you're whose existence you're opposed to really is. And I always think about my parents who, if you ask them, they will tell you they are Republicans.
Mhm.
I'm actually in their house right now. Hopefully they're not listening. They will tell you they're Republicans. When you start drilling down, you take away the label and you say to them, "Do you think we should have nationalized health care?" They say, "Actually, yeah, we should."
Right, yeah, when you take all the indicators, all the, like, I guess, the terms that make it what it is, it's the same thing with my folks. It's fascinating. Like, we always come down to we want the same things, but we really disagree on how to get there.
It's so true, and then I thought, my father was saying last night, "So and so's a leftist," and so I said, "Okay, let me play this game." Like, "Okay." I was like, "How do you feel about ICE? How do
Mhm.
you feel
Mhm.
about billionaires?"
Mhm.
I'm like, "You sound a little bit like leftists right now."
I think that's such a perfect like, those 2 examples that you just stated, like, we can come back to our slice of time and look at ICE and look at billionaires hoarding wealth and say, "These are huge social problems that our system actually perpetuates and created," but there must be a version of that even in early civilization, right? The policing of those who were other and therefore a threat to whatever somebody's narrative is, safety, security, um, uh, peace, um, prosperity. So the ice of ancient civilization, and then also billionaires, like the person who was really adept at counting or figured out how to sort of game the token system early on, and everyone goes, that guy, he's real smart. Look at all the tokens he's got."
That is exactly what happened.
And instead of going, look at all the tokens he's got, what a crook, or like, oh, I don't trust that guy, he seems to always just be after our tokens. I think there has been a cultural, I mean, and probably it's been up and down, but there have been many times in our cultural history where we're like, look at all those tokens. Maybe one day I could have tokens.
That's the problem. The problem is everybody thinks they're gonna one day have tokens, and
Yep.
just in case, they gotta make sure the taxes stay low because they don't wanna have to give
Right.
them away to anybody else.
Right. And instead, they're just keeping that one guy with the tokens, keeping all the tokens.
So true. In ancient Mesopotamia, after the the towns started becoming cities and the cities became city states, there actually were people. They were priests who
Mm,
assumed the position of the person who keeps track of all the tokens,
right.
and then therefore controlled all the provisions or the wages. And there were upsides to it, which was someone was managing life, and therefore everyone didn't have to be subsistence farmers. You could become a potter, you could do metalwork.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds delightful. But
Mm-hmm.
there over and over, right? We invest our trust in the person who has taken that administrative duty, and it there I don't it's hard to find examples where someone did that in a really great way.
Right. Like, because you have to always ask why. I think it's the same thing. The modern equivalent is like why people don't trust politicians. Because there are people who get into politics because of a deep desire and a social justice kind of cause and orientation towards ensuring public safety and prosperity and serenity and public good. And then we always have to ask the question, like, does absolute power corrupt absolutely? Like, did this person go into it because they were power hungry, or once they started to feel that power, did they realize? So you've got the early token counter, who maybe that person was in that role because they were good at counting, or maybe it was because they said, I'm ordained by God. And everybody goes, I believe you, which is like, ooh, that's shisty. Or maybe that person got into it for any number of reasons. Maybe they did see early on, ooh, the counter gets to pocket some of the tokens. But either way, even if it was like a kind of noble cause, right? Like I'm just pretty good at counting, and everybody says the counting person should probably count the tokens. After a while, the counting person goes, "Oh, nobody else can count. They won't notice a few of these missing."
This is what I think about, like, academic administrators and
Mhm.
hospital administrators. I
Mhm.
always
Yeah.
think about it because, I feel like perhaps I will end up doing one of those jobs as an academic administrator someday. And then I think, but am I just going to become evil?
Right, exactly. Like, does having that much, whatever you want to define it as, I was going to say resource or that much power. And then it was like, oh, yeah, what are we talking about here? That much data, that much control over information. How does one do that without some amount of personal? I mean, our president is like the most extreme example we have had in modern history. Like, we all can tell that the reason he is the president is so he can have secondary gain. Like, he only wants to be president to get richer and to get his name out there more and to be on buildings and line his pockets. Like, he's using it as a conduit to that.
Undoubtedly. I wonder, sometimes I think about how, okay, let's talk about President Obama,
Mhm.
who, there are things that he did that I feel like were disappointing.
Same, yeah. Some stuff
Very,
with some journalists, some stuff,
yeah,
it's like, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I
But
could criticize him for sure.
what I feel like he did really well is he surrounded himself with A, smart people,
Mhm.
and B, it doesn't seem like he surrounded himself with people who are gonna tell him what he wanted to hear.
Exactly. He surrounded himself with people who would challenge him.
Mhm.
And I think that is so important. If the token counter early on said, I'm going to count the tokens, but you guys can choose 5 other people from the community to check my books every day. That's a totally different system than I'm going to count all the tokens. Trust me. And no, you're not allowed to enter my office while I'm counting tokens.
It's true. And I think that's where it comes back to the 21st century and what we see how much trust that governments around the world, and certainly the US government, are putting in tech companies. Because
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about, for example, we've been talking about ICE partnering with Palantir to develop Immigration OS to find people to deport.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a pretty dangerous situation because governments want to do things that involve a lot of data. They don't have the capacity to actually do it themselves. So they contract with companies to do it. But in the US, particularly, without something like GDPR, it's in an environment where there's very little in the way of regulation.
Right.
And so essentially, you have tech companies working with governments that have given them exactly what they want, which is room to do whatever they want. Um, and governments who are saying, okay, just tell me how you're going to fix my problems. And so it's this little echo chamber in which, where's the pushback? And
Yeah,
so it's
and
gotta
where's
come
the
from us.
rails?
Yeah.
Exactly. Where are the rails? Like the government says, "Hey, tech company, I want you to look at all this big data to tell us where the threats are." And the tech company goes, "Cool, give me a bunch of money for that. And also, thanks for all the access. We're going to figure out how to monetize all this access on the back end too. What a good deal for us." And as you mentioned, nobody has the time to do it all themselves. So they're like, "Oh, we'll just develop an algorithm, and now we have, LLMs and other AI approaches. We'll develop an algorithm using, the most cutting edge tech to just do it for us. But when you're using AI to develop that tech, you don't necessarily have access to the how. Some things are a black box. So it's like, let's hope it all works." you know and even if it does work the way they intend it to work, it's what is that old adage that if you are not paying for the product, you are the product.
Oof.
Like, we are our own lives, our behaviors, our decision making is being traded to market to, like, it's so depressing.
It is. I don't know if I'm supposed to try and fix that, but,
No. But do you notice when it comes to this conversation about data, and I'm curious how you approach this in your work, whether it's in the book or in your greater work, this movement away from like making stuff. And it's true, we still need stuff, but we've outsourced a lot of our stuff making to large countries with sometimes questionable regulation, where individual human rights are really trampled upon, so that we can get cheaper and cheaper stuff because, it's cheaper. The labor is cheap and or free, meaning human trafficking, slavery, all of those
Mm.
things. But a lot now of what is paying the bills for the government, for these large tech companies, is not stuff. They're trading their equity, their commodities. It's information. Like, we're not making anything anymore. So is it not like a bubble? Like, is this not built on a house of cards?
Oh, I'm completely convinced it is. And part of this is because when you hear there was recently a study that came out in January of 2025. When you ask CEOs if they thought that AI was going to help them reduce their labor force, as if that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
They about it was around 60% or so said, yeah, absolutely. This is going
Mm-hmm.
to lead to a reduction in headcount. And the study of CEOs from the same people doing it came out last week, said 21% of them say that. And I'm sure they think that's a bad thing. I think it
Mm-hmm.
sounds great, because people having jobs, to me, is a good thing. And
Right.
also, I do not trust the I don't trust that any technology should be making decisions about anything without humans being involved.
Right, at least having oversight or
Yeah.
a check and a balance, right? I'm happy to offload portions of my job. I cannot wait until my hospital has an AI that's good enough that I can do a therapy session with my patient and just press enter at the end and my note is written for me. Like, that would be phenomenal, because that is a part of my job that I hate, and I shouldn't be getting paid to do this like grunt work that doesn't really serve anybody except the insurance companies.
Yeah, I just
Like
wanted
I
to deal with my email.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there are things that it's like, "Yes, yes, yes, please." But I sometimes worry. I think about the way that we do ballot initiatives in California, like the way we vote, where I love my state to death. But one of the things I think is very problematic is we sometimes will decouple the initiative from the way we're going to pay for the
Oh,
initiative. So,
for sure.
you have this ballot and we want all this cool stuff. And everybody goes, yes, yes, on 17 or whatever. And then they go, okay, we're going to do this, this, this in order to pay for it. Well, no, don't want that. And all of a sudden we have all this stuff we said we're going to do and we don't have any funding for it. And I think about that with, sure, in a utopia, a tech CEO saying, I'm going to cut my labor force in half and have the robots and the machines take all of this menial labor is great if we have universal basic income. It's like, but you can't decouple those things.
It's so true. And I think the hard part is that they keep talking as if one day AI, generative AI, super intelligence is going to free us from all of the things we don't actually want to do, and we're going to have these lives of leisure. And I wonder who's paying for this.
Exactly. Who's going to pay for it? Oh, is that why you're amassing all this wealth? I don't think so.
And the other bubbly part about it is that the funding model is completely suspect because the enterprise the enterprise license charges, the consumer subscription charges for any of these models, Claude, from Anthropic, or
Mhm.
ChatGPT from OpenAI, they're not actually covering the cost of running the models. But let's be
Right.
even putting aside that there are environmental costs with
Mhm.
water and emissions and so forth. Those are all very real things. Even you put that aside, their model is being supported by either mergers and acquisitions that are happening within Silicon Valley or vast amounts of venture capital. And all that funding is propping this up.
Right.
And sometimes sometimes I look at my stock portfolio and I think this
Mhm.
is great. And then sometimes, more of the time, I just think, so what happens when finally the venture capitalists say, you know what, we cannot infinitely prop up
Right.
a technology that actually has no return on investment.
Mhm. Yeah, the Great Depression happens, right? Or the 2008 financial crisis. Like, your stock portfolio is in the toilet when that happens.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's a scary proposition for anybody who is, and I say this myself being one of them, anybody who is privileged enough to be concerned about that, And it's I love the way that you directly tie these existential, eschatological, like really terrifying realities of this kind of precipice that a lot of us feel we are on in modern society back to the earliest anthropologic evidence that we have of human beings existing around each other, and then carry it all the way through the recorded human history that we have. There are good examples, though, right? Like, there are examples where some cultures figured out how to utilize data, saw that data and information is power, and managed to at least maintain some level of, I don't know, egalitarianism? Or is that just a myth?
absolutely. There are examples of that. I think for example, the use of the kipu, which was it's the Incan word for a system of information management that involved tying knots and strings, which was used as early as around 3500 BC or so, same time
Mhm.
as the emergence of first civilizations in Mesopotamia, but in ancient Peru, where it's an interesting society archaeologically because there's actually no evidence of there having been any war. There's
Mm.
people who didn't have war. And there was also there's no ruler in the sense of there was a king, which was pretty standard for civilizations of that time to have a king. Certainly, that there was hierarchical society, but it was not hierarchical in that same way that it was in,
Mhm.
say, Mesopotamia or the Near East. And so they would certainly someone was in charge of tying the knots and the strings, and they were sort of like mnemonic devices. So they would, feel the string and feel how it was tied, or how far was it spaced from another knot, to remember what the information was. But
Mm.
it was an example where it was you truly just treated as a method of managing the scale of life without it having to become this kind of massive, you know, massively unequal society. And I think that's a really good example of that.
Yeah, it almost, like, begs the sort of question of the chicken and the egg, sort of, I is it that the tools themselves allowed for a, intentionality that already existed? Or is it that the tools created an intentionality? Like, did this ancient Inca society just have egalitarian values? And did they develop these tools in order to have this sort of just I couldn't say completely neutral, but, like, likely neutral, outcome? Or, the tokens, were the tokens there early on, the clay tokens in Mesopotamia, were they there early on simply as a tool, or were they actually, was it a feature, not a bug, that they became, existed as a means to divide power unequally?
My completely unscientific speculation on this is that if it hadn't been the tokens, it would have been something else.
Yep. That's how I feel about religion, if I'm being honest. Like, it's not the religion itself. I think a lot of people blame religion for a lot of things, and I'm like, "No, that's just the way they did it." Those people were gonna do that using some other method.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not, trying to paint the ancient civilization of Caral Supe at Peru as like some kind of utopian paradise. We actually don't know. We
Right,
just
right.
know what we see there and what we don't see there. But at the same time, it's quite telling when you look to ancient Mesopotamia and you see over time, based on the layers of archaeological research that people have done, is the movement of the tokens out of the homes into the granaries, into the
Mhm.
temples, and then the tablets with the cuneiform writing are in the temples, and so it's becomes very clear that the people in the temples have, like, assumed the control over this tool and then are using it, I mean, perhaps let's be nice, like, at first, it's like, "Great, it's a tool. It can help me do a thing," but then, all of a sudden you are a warlord going after the next town and
Right.
trying to take it over. And then I think about, one of the recent studies that came out about generative AI, which is that it was there's a study that says that it was making tiny changes in output it was generating on the topic of abortion rights, and that
Mm.
those tiny changes were actually changing the meaning. And if people aren't reading the output that they're asking for before they are using it somewhere, they may not actually realize that a small semantic change has actually changed the meaning of their sentence, the political meaning of their sentence.
Mm.
And so now we're in this weird situation where, again, like there's this tool, arguably not inherently bad. People are using it. They're using it because, they want efficiency, they want optimization, they want to get ahead, whatever it is they're using it for. But now it's sort of flipping in a way that the token couldn't and the tablet couldn't, in which the actual tool itself is changing the output. And that to
Right.
me is where we should be deeply worried.
Yeah, there's this, like, potential for a runaway feedback loop. I mean, I think about climate change, and I think about all of these other sort of large systemic inflection points that human beings have reached, where we see then massive population decline, where we see them huge, industrial revolution, right? Huge increases in danger to health and human safety, but also to all of the organisms on the planet. These financial systems, I sometimes worry, I don't even worry. I think I am somewhat cynical about the genie being out of the bottle. Like, we can't recork this at this point. We just have to figure out how to manage it.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we could think about it as something that we could iterate on and improve. I, I think the ship sailed. It was funny because when I was writing this book, I realized after the fact that I had tried very, very hard to not have to not communicate that really this is just about capitalism, or
Right.
really this is just about colonialism, because it's not. And certainly people aren't running a capitalist economy in an ancient Sumer.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's a very interesting correlation that capitalism, transatlantic slave trade, colonialism were all happening at the same time, and it's hard to separate them out from each other. And so it's very afterwards I think I was at the point at which I was doing my final revisions, and I realized I had not used the word capitalism once because I was trying so hard
Yeah.
not to just have this be, oh, it's like some like leftist like critique who just thinks that capitalism is bad. Like, well, actually,
Mhm.
yeah, I kind of do, but that was not
But
trying
it's
to
so much
alienate the readers here.
And it's so much deeper than that.
It is.
Capitalism, as we define it, is a much more complex system, and it has specific values, and but this is like this is the sort of the building blocks. These are the things that happen before capital. And like the way that we're looking at it, it's even in socialist nations there were capitalist undertones, because where there is property, there is capitalism.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it just yeah, and it's not like this. I mean, I have two examples, one from Stalinist Russia and one from Mao's China, where it's not like things were going much better for the people living there. And so, but it was very funny because I realized that I had taken such pains to not have this be reducible to capitalism is the problem, that I didn't even
Mhm.
have it in there. And so I had to go back fix that because I don't want to have not named part of the problem. But this, at the same time, I think that this particular mode in the US of, I guess some people call it late stage capitalism, but the deep lack of regulation, the corporations are have the rights of people. These are, to me, areas for improvement. And there's no reason we can't. I mean, I live in Salem, Massachusetts, and we're doing a universal basic income pilot. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty cool. And there's other cities, other towns around the country have found out that turns out one way you can solve the problem of people being unhoused is providing them with housing.
Yeah, and you've seen it in places as wildly different as like Salt Lake City, Utah, and Los Angeles, California.
Yeah, and so if I think the my worry is that the world feels so overwhelming right now that it's easy to feel like there's absolutely nothing that anyone could do about it because it's these big systems, right? Big
Right.
tech, capitalism. But that's not actually true. I just look at I mean, obviously I live in like a little like utopia in Salem, Massachusetts with our rainbow flag crosswalks and our universal basic income pilot. But
Yeah.
I do think, that's a community that said, this is what we want to try. And maybe it's going to work. Maybe it's not going to work, but we're going to try it. And that doesn't mean that everyone there agrees, because there are definitely people who think that this is completely ass backwards. But we are, on the whole, have agreed to try to do something different. And I think it's that those kinds of changes on the local level, in your community, what can you try and advocate for? How do you talk to your parent and say, like, are you really a Republican? Because
Right.
doesn't sound, I mean, you don't say that part, but you talking to them about specific policies, or what do you really think? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Have you considered this perspective that maybe isn't your own? I think that's where I find the hope.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so funny because, you're very good at this because any other podcaster would end the conversation right there because you did such a beautiful job of introducing us to the concept, of picking a few examples throughout history, and then closing with this beautiful message of hope, and yet I am not every other podcaster. And I cannot help but like, it's been boring into my brain the whole time we've been talking. You mentioned, this approach where capitalism is underlying a lot of it, but you don't want it to be the end all and sort of the overall concept. We've talked about the sort of the intersectional nature of colonialism and of all of these kind of variables that underlie this long story of data and information and power. And yet, I cannot help but keep going back in my mind to my interviews that I've done on the show before with Angela Saini and her work. Both her books, Inferior and Superior, sure, but specifically her book, The Patriarchs,
Hmm.
about the rise of kind of the ruling male class and how it's situated back in these early attempts to record data and to pass on wealth,
Mhm.
right? This is yours, this is mine. Who owns that piece? And while there have been matrilineal
Mhm.
societies that she points to, we saw a huge shift into patrilineal property ownership and spreading. And and we've have small examples of matriarchs, but honestly, I can't point to a single time in history where the dominant power structure was held by women. And I just cannot help, and it's my cynicism and my feminist ideals here. I just cannot help but wonder, what would all of this look like if all the way at the beginning, that early decision making around power, however it came to be, was shifted in the other direction? Would women have just become men like? Or would everything we're talking about be wildly different?
That's a great thought experiment because, of course, immediately I want to say Margaret Thatcher, but then one argues that we had Margaret Thatcher precisely because
Because of men, yeah.
exactly
Yeah, because
right.
the only way to play with the boys is to become one of the boys, or even more of a boy than the rest of them, yeah, and we see that a lot with women in positions of power in male-dominant fields.
It's
They're, like,
true.
the most violent and aggressive in their approach because they have to be.
They absolutely do. And, always makes me think of how, there are some women that one encounters in the workplace who are, senior to you, who they're either the kind who think I went through this horrible experience to get where I got to and therefore you must too, or the
Mhm.
ones who think I went through it and therefore I want to make it better for you so you don't have to.
Yeah.
And those are the people I wish would have been in power in ancient Mesopotamia.
Same, same. Those are the people I wish were in power now, and you're right, all it can be is a thought experiment, but I just can't help. It's the water we swim, because the patriarchy is the water we swim in. I can't help but always want to point out that these conversations about power throughout human history also can't be separated from conversations about gender inequity,
Mhm.
because it's like when we talk about violent crime and people are talking about like predictive value of violent crime in this area versus that area. And okay, is it the amount of guns? Is it the amount of poverty? Is it the amount of drugs? Is it the amount of whatever? The most predictive variable is maleness, by and large, over anything else. It is so much more predictive, but we just leave it out of the formula because it's so obvious.
It's true, and one of the things I really took a lot of care to try to do was to not have this book be yet another book of great men, and it's really hard because,
Or shitty
unfortunately,
men. Yeah.
great shitty men.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. But they
in
were
some ways,
men.
it is a book yeah, so many of them were men. There's
Yeah.
one example that I'm thinking of that I didn't end up leaving in the book because there were too many examples. There's a woman
Mhm.
named Tin Hanan who was essentially a leader of a group of Berbers, like, around the beginning of the Common Era, and she his origin story is vague, but it comes out of Berber, the Berber legends of people who um, still, the culture community still exists.
Mhm.
And in their legends, she is sort of their great, matriarch, and she came kind of walking on riding a horse and walking with her servant one day. She came from a elite family in the mountains
Mhm.
and ended up, in the Sahel and attracting groups of nomadic people. And doing so, because of her knowledge of the earth, of her wisdom, her ability to figure out how to find water. And none of the kinds of all the other a lot of the other women I would encounter were always sort of mimicking the male model of gaining power.
Yeah, yeah.
And she wasn't, right? It was a very, very different approach. And I mean, one could argue, you know, it is sort of essentializing gender to say that the women who adopted a so-called like sort of male model were doing that, as opposed to, one can, be express female power in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, it does
Absolutely. Yeah.
strike me to think that, in an example like the one of Tin Hinan, which is, you know, happening outside of, say, the context of the Roman Empire, which is also happening at the time, somebody was saying things could be different, and that was a woman.
Right. I want you to write that book. Next project. I would love to learn more about her. She sounds absolutely fascinating. But first, everybody, you got to dig through this one because there's so much good stuff in here. We didn't even remotely, not that we didn't get to all of it. We barely got to any of it. But unfortunately, we can't keep talking all day long. But this has been such a fascinating chat. I would love to have you back on the show at some point because I just really enjoyed it and I learned so much.
This was so much fun, and likewise, I would love to talk to you forever.
Yay, everybody. The book is Data Empire, The Power of Information to Organize, Control, and Dominate by Dr. Roopika Risam. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.